The morning sun cast long shadows across the Veterans Day parade route in downtown San Diego as Sarah Mitchell adjusted her dress blue uniform one final time. The fabric felt foreign against her skin, heavy with the weight of deception she had carried for 3 years. At 28, Sarah had perfected the art of being someone she wasn't, and today would be her most daring performance yet. The crowd gathered along Harbor Drive, a sea of red, white, and blue that stretched for blocks. Children waved small American flags while their parents held up phones to capture the moment. Sarah took her place among the other veterans, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. She had started small, telling stories at local bars about her service in Afghanistan. The lies came easier than she expected, each detail building upon the last, until she had constructed an entire identity. According to her carefully crafted narrative, she had served 8 years as a Navy SEAL, completing multiple tours in hostile territory. The respect in people's eyes when she shared these stories became like a drug she couldn't quit. Sarah's real story was far less heroic. She had joined the Navy straight out of high school, serving 2 years as a hospital corpsman before receiving a medical discharge due to severe anxiety and panic attacks. The shame of her early departure from service had eaten away at her self-worth for years. When she first told someone she had been a SEAL, the immediate transformation in their demeanor was intoxicating. Suddenly, she wasn't just Sarah the failed sailor, she was Sarah the warrior. The parade began to move, and Sarah fell into step with the other veterans. Her uniform was authentic, purchased from a military surplus store, and carefully altered to display the appropriate insignia. She had spent months researching SEAL traditions, memorizing names of actual units and deployment locations. Every ribbon and medal on her chest told a story of valor that existed only in her imagination. As they marched down the street, Sarah spotted familiar faces in the crowd. There was Mrs. Henderson from the grocery store, who always thanked her for her service when Sarah wore her military jacket. Next to her stood Tom Rodriguez, a local businessman who had hired Sarah for part-time work specifically because of her military background. These people believed in her heroic narrative, and their faith had become the foundation of her new identity. The weight of deception grew heavier with each step. Sarah had received job offers, speaking engagements, and even romantic interest based on her fabricated military record. She had spoken at high schools about courage and perseverance, sharing fictional accounts of brotherhood forged in combat. Each lie had been easier to tell than the truth about her struggles with mental health and her inability to complete her original military commitment. A news crew had positioned themselves near the reviewing stand, their cameras capturing the parade for the evening broadcast. Sarah straightened her shoulders and smiled as they passed, knowing that her image might appear on television that night. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. Every public appearance increased the risk of discovery, but it also fed the hunger for recognition that drove her deeper into deception. The parade route took them past the USS Midway Museum, where actual Navy veterans had gathered to watch. Sarah noticed several older men in military attire studying the marching veterans with the keen eye of those who had served. Their scrutiny made her nervous, but she maintained her composure, reminding herself that she had fooled everyone so far. Among the spectators stood Admiral Robert Hayes, a decorated Navy officer who had spent 30 years in service before retiring to San Diego. He watched the parade with the practiced eye of someone who had commanded thousands of sailors and could spot authenticity from across a crowded room. Something about Sarah's bearing caught his attention, though he couldn't immediately identify what seemed off. The Admiral had served alongside actual SEALs throughout his career, and knew the subtle signs that marked those elite warriors. There was a particular way they carried themselves, a confidence born from surviving the most rigorous training in the military. As Sarah passed, Admiral Hayes noticed that despite her perfect uniform and precise marching, something essential was missing from her presentation. As the parade continued toward Balboa Park, Sarah felt increasingly confident. The crowd's enthusiasm was infectious, and she found herself believing her own story more deeply than ever. Children pointed at her SEAL insignia with wide-eyed wonder, while adults nodded respectfully. This was the validation she had craved since her early discharge from the Navy. The reviewing stand came into view, occupied by local politicians and military officials. Sarah recognized the mayor and several city council members, all of whom would be greeting the veterans after the parade concluded. She had attended several military appreciation events where these same officials had shaken her hand and thanked her for her service to the SEAL teams. Behind the reviewing stand, a small group of military police officers had taken position. They were part of the parade's security detail, but one officer, Sergeant Maria Santos, had received a tip earlier that morning. An anonymous caller had reported seeing someone in military uniform who might not be authorized to wear it. Stolen valor cases had become increasingly common, and Sergeant Santos took these reports seriously. The caller had provided a description that matched Sarah perfectly. A young woman, wearing SEAL insignia, who had been spotted at multiple military events around the city. The tipster claimed to be a veteran who had grown suspicious after hearing Sarah tell contradictory stories about her service record. While the evidence was circumstantial, it was enough to warrant closer investigation. As Sarah's group approached the reviewing stand, Sergeant Santos stepped forward. Her trained eye immediately went to Sarah's uniform, checking for the small details that often revealed imposters. The ribbons were in correct order, the insignia properly placed, and the uniform itself appeared genuine. However, something about Sarah's nervous energy set off alarm bells in the sergeant's mind. The moment Sarah had dreaded for 3 years was finally arriving, though she didn't know it yet. She continued marching with the other veterans, her smile growing wider as they neared the ceremony's conclusion. In her mind, she was already planning her next appearance, perhaps at a local college where she could inspire students with her fictional tales of heroism. Admiral Hayes had moved closer to the parade route, his curiosity about Sarah intensifying. He found himself studying not just her uniform, but her entire demeanor. Years of experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and something about this young woman didn't add up. He decided to attend the reception following the parade, where he might have an opportunity to speak with her directly. The last few blocks of the parade passed in a blur for Sarah. The cheering crowds, the military music, and the sense of belonging all combined to create an almost euphoric feeling. She had successfully infiltrated one of the most significant military events in San Diego, surrounded by actual veterans who had accepted her as one of their own. As the parade reached its endpoint at Balboa Park, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and exhilaration. She had pulled off her greatest performance yet, marching alongside genuine heroes while wearing their uniform and claiming their heritage. The other veterans around her began to disperse, some heading to the official reception while others simply melted back into their civilian lives. Sarah was preparing to leave when she felt a firm hand on her shoulder. She turned to find Sergeant Santos standing behind her, wearing an expression that immediately made Sarah's blood run cold. The sergeant's badge caught the sunlight, and Sarah realized with growing horror that her 3-year charade might be coming to an end. The park around them continued to buzz with celebration, families taking photos with veterans and children asking for autographs. But for Sarah, the world suddenly felt very small and very dangerous. She had always known this moment might come, but she had convinced herself that her careful preparation would keep her safe indefinitely. Sergeant Santos studied Sarah's face, noting the flash of panic that briefly crossed her features before being replaced by a forced smile. Years of police work had taught her to recognize guilt, and Sarah was practically broadcasting it. The sergeant made a decision that would change both of their lives forever, though neither woman could have predicted the extraordinary turn of events that was about to unfold. Sergeant Santos stepped closer to Sarah, her voice low but firm enough to cut through the celebration around them. "I need to speak with you about your uniform." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, though she fought to maintain her composure. She had practiced for this moment in her mind countless times, but the reality was far more terrifying than any imagined scenario. Sarah's mouth went dry as she forced a smile. "Is there a problem, officer?" Her voice came out higher than usual, betraying the panic rising in her chest. Around them, families continued their celebrations, completely unaware of the drama unfolding. Children laughed and ran between the dispersing veterans while their parents chatted about the moving ceremony they had just witnessed. The sergeant's eyes moved methodically over Sarah's uniform, taking inventory of every detail. I've received reports about someone impersonating military personnel at local events. You match the description I was given. She pulled out a small notepad, her pen poised to write. I'm going to need to see your military identification and discharge papers. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to formulate a response. She had always carried fake identification when wearing her uniform, but she knew it wouldn't hold up under serious scrutiny. The documents had been created using online templates and a printer in her apartment. Good enough for casual encounters, but useless against real investigation. Before Sarah could respond, a commotion nearby caught their attention. A group of actual Navy SEALs had gathered near the memorial wall, their presence immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with military bearing. These men moved with the confident ease of warriors who had nothing to prove, their conversation peppered with inside jokes and references that only they would understand. One of them, a tall man, with graying hair and intense blue eyes, noticed the confrontation between Sarah and the sergeant. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb had spent 15 years with the SEAL teams and had developed an almost supernatural ability to spot imposters. Something about the woman in uniform caught his attention, though he couldn't immediately identify what seemed wrong. Sarah noticed the SEALs watching and felt her panic intensify. These were the real deal, men who had lived the life she had only pretended to experience. If they became involved in this situation, her deception would be exposed within minutes. She needed to find a way out. And fast. I don't understand why you're questioning me, Sarah said, her voice gaining strength from desperation. I served my country with honor, and I have every right to wear this uniform. She reached into her purse, pretending to search for identification while actually buying time to think. Sergeant Santos remained patient but firm. I'm sure you did. And if that's the case, this will be cleared up quickly, but I still need to see proper documentation. She glanced around, noticing that their conversation was beginning to draw attention from other veterans and their families. The situation was escalating exactly as Sarah had feared. She could see curious faces turning their way, including some people she recognized from previous military events. Mrs. Henderson from the grocery store was among the observers, her expression confused as she watched Sarah being questioned by police. Chief Webb approached slowly, his experienced eye taking in the scene. He had dealt with stolen valor cases before and knew how devastating they could be to the veteran community. The disrespect shown by imposters often overshadowed the genuine sacrifices made by real service members. However, something about this particular situation felt different. Everything all right here, Sergeant? Webb asked, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command. Sarah felt her knees weaken as she realized she was now facing not just a police officer but an actual SEAL who could expose her fraud with a single question. Sergeant Santos nodded respectfully, recognizing Webb's military bearing. Just verifying some information, Chief. This young woman claims to have served with the SEALs, but I've received reports suggesting she might not be legitimate. Webb studied Sarah carefully, noting the fear in her eyes despite her attempts to appear confident. Her uniform was impeccable, every detail correct according to regulations. The ribbons told a story of distinguished service, including decorations that would have required extraordinary bravery to earn. Yet something fundamental was missing from her presentation. What team did you serve with? Webb asked Sarah directly, his tone conversational but his eyes sharp. It was a simple question, but one that would quickly reveal whether she had any real knowledge of SEAL operations. Sarah's mind went blank. She had memorized dozens of details about SEAL training and deployment schedules, but under pressure, the carefully rehearsed information scattered like leaves in the wind. Team 6, she stammered, choosing the most famous unit she could remember. Webb's expression didn't change, but other SEALs in the area exchanged meaningful glances. Team 6 was officially known as DevGru, and no legitimate SEAL would refer to it so casually in mixed company. The mistake was subtle but telling to those who knew better. The crowd around them had grown larger, with more veterans stopping to see what was happening. Some whispered among themselves, speculating about the nature of the confrontation. Sarah could feel their eyes on her, and the weight of their attention made it difficult to breathe. Admiral Hayes had been watching the situation develop from near the memorial wall. His decades of experience with personnel issues told him that something significant was unfolding, and he decided to intervene before the situation got out of hand. The Admiral approached with the measured pace of someone accustomed to command. "Gentlemen, Sergeant," Admiral Hayes said as he joined the group. His presence immediately changed the dynamic of the conversation, as everyone recognized the authority he carried. "I couldn't help but notice the discussion. Perhaps I can be of assistance." Sarah felt a new wave of terror wash over her. An admiral represented the highest levels of military leadership, someone with the knowledge and authority to expose her deception instantly. She considered running, but her legs felt like lead, and she knew that fleeing would only confirm everyone's suspicions. The Admiral's eyes moved to Sarah, studying her with the same intensity that Webb had shown. However, his expression was more curious than accusatory. "Young lady, I understand there are questions about your service record. Would you mind if I asked you a few questions myself?" Before Sarah could respond, her panic finally overwhelmed her carefully maintained facade. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered, her voice breaking. The words came out involuntarily, 3 years of accumulated guilt and fear, finally finding their voice. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The admission hung in the air like a physical presence, shocking everyone within earshot. Veterans who had been watching from a distance moved closer, their expressions ranging from confusion to anger as they realized what they were witnessing. Sergeant Santos stepped forward, her hand moving to her handcuffs. "Ma'am, I'm placing you under arrest for violation of federal law regarding the unauthorized wearing of military uniforms and decorations." The formal words seemed to echo in the sudden silence that had fallen over the crowd. Sarah's legs finally gave out, and she sank to her knees on the park's grass. The weight of her deception had finally become too heavy to carry, and the relief of confession mixed with terror at what would come next. She had imagined this moment many times, but the reality was far more crushing than anything her mind had prepared her for. The other veterans watched in stunned silence as Sergeant Santos began the arrest procedure. Some shook their heads in disgust, while others appeared more saddened than angry. The violation of trust felt personal to each of them, as their own service had been diminished by Sarah's actions. Admiral Hayes, however, found himself studying Sarah with increasing interest rather than condemnation. Something about her collapse seemed genuine in a way that her military persona had not. The tattoo on her left forearm, partially visible beneath her uniform sleeve, caught his attention. It was small and seemed out of place on someone trying to project a false military image. As Sergeant Santos prepared to read Sarah her rights, the Admiral made a decision that would surprise everyone present. "Sergeant, if I may interrupt for just a moment." His voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. The arrest process paused as Admiral Hayes knelt beside Sarah, his voice gentle but insistent. "Before we proceed, I need to ask you about something. That tattoo on your arm. Where did you get it?" Sarah looked up through her tears, confusion replacing some of the panic in her eyes. The question seemed completely unrelated to her arrest, but the Admiral's tone suggested it was important. "I don't understand why that matters," she managed to say. Admiral Hayes leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that only Sarah could hear. His next words would change everything they thought they knew about this young woman and transform a case of stolen valor into something far more complex and surprising than anyone could have imagined. Admiral Hayes leaned in closer to Sarah, his weathered face inches from hers as he studied the small tattoo on her forearm. The design was simple but distinctive. A trident, surrounded by a wreath, with numbers beneath it that only someone with extensive military knowledge would recognize. His voice was barely audible as he whispered, "That tattoo's genuine." The words hit Sarah like an electric shock. She stared at the Admiral in confusion, her mind struggling to process what he had just said. Around them, the crowd waited in tense silence while Sergeant Santos paused the arrest procedure, clearly puzzled by the Admiral's intervention. "I don't understand," Sarah whispered back, her voice shaking. The tattoo had been with her for so long that she rarely thought about it anymore. It was a remnant from a part of her life that she had tried to forget, a time when her real story had been far more complicated than anyone knew. Admiral Hayes studied her face carefully, his expression shifting from curiosity to recognition. "Those numbers under the trident, they represent Operation Neptune's Spear, don't they? The Bin Laden raid." His voice remained quiet, but there was growing certainty in his tone. Only a handful of people were authorized to commemorate that operation with ink. Sarah's eyes widened as memories she had buried came flooding back. The tattoo had been done in a small shop outside Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, along with several other members of her medical unit. They had been sworn to secrecy about their involvement, and she had honored that oath even when constructing her false identity. The Admiral's next question came with gentle insistence. "You were Hospital Corpsman Second Class Sarah Mitchell, weren't you? Attached to Naval Special Warfare Development Group as medical support." It wasn't really a question. Admiral Hayes was piecing together information that had been classified for over a decade. Chief Webb, who had been listening intently, stepped closer. His expression had completely changed from suspicion to something approaching respect. "Doc Mitchell?" he said quietly, recognition dawning in his voice. "You were part of the medical team that provided support during the planning phase." "I remember now." Sarah felt the world spinning around her as her carefully constructed lies crumbled, only to be replaced by a truth she had tried to escape. "I wasn't supposed to tell anyone," she managed to say, her voice barely audible. "We all signed agreements. I thought no one would ever know." The crowd around them sensed that something significant was happening, though most couldn't understand the quiet conversation taking place. Sergeant Santos looked between Admiral Hayes and Sarah, clearly confused by the sudden change in atmosphere. Admiral Hayes helped Sarah to her feet, his movements gentle but purposeful. "Sarah, I need you to listen to me carefully. Your service record shows a medical discharge for anxiety and panic attacks. What it doesn't show is the classified work you did before that discharge." The memories came back in a rush. Sarah remembered the months of intensive training, learning to provide medical support in the most dangerous environments imaginable. She recalled the endless briefings about operational security and the weight of responsibility that came with supporting elite military units. The stress had been overwhelming, contributing to the anxiety that eventually ended her career. "I was just medical support," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger but still uncertain. "I never saw combat. I never completed SEAL training. I was discharged before I could finish my assignment." The shame that had driven her to create false stories came pouring out. Chief Webb shook his head firmly. "Doc, you provided medical support during the most critical military operation of our generation. You were part of the team that made it possible. That's not nothing. That's everything." Admiral Hayes nodded in agreement. "The classification levels were so high that your real service couldn't be acknowledged publicly. Your discharge papers were deliberately vague to protect operational security. But that tattoo proves you were there, part of something that changed history." Sarah looked down at the small tattoo that had carried her real story all along. She had gotten it to commemorate what she thought was her one meaningful contribution to military service, never imagining it would one day reveal the truth she had been hiding behind lies. Sergeant Santos stepped forward, still holding her handcuffs but looking thoroughly confused. "Admiral, I need to understand what's happening here. Is this woman legitimate military, or not?" The Admiral turned to address not just the sergeant but the crowd that had gathered to watch Sarah's arrest. This young woman served her country in ways that couldn't be publicly acknowledged. Her medical discharge was legitimate, but it came after she had already made contributions to national security that most people will never know about. The other SEALs in the area had moved closer, their expressions shifting from suspicion to something approaching brotherhood. They understood classified operations and the burden of carrying secrets. Chief Webb spoke up, his voice carrying to the crowd. Sometimes the most important service happens in shadows. Just because it can't be talked about doesn't mean it didn't happen. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of her situation. For 3 years, she had lived with the shame of her early discharge, believing that her brief service meant nothing. The panic attacks that ended her career had felt like a personal failure, especially when compared to the heroic narratives of others. "But I lied," Sarah said, looking at Admiral Hayes with tears in her eyes. "I told people I was a SEAL. I claimed credit for things I never did. I wore ribbons I didn't earn." The guilt that had motivated her deception wouldn't disappear simply because her real service had been revealed. Admiral Hayes placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "Yes, you did lie, and that was wrong. But you lied because you thought your real service didn't matter. You couldn't tell people what you actually did, so you invented something you thought would be worthy of respect." The crowd had grown quiet as word spread about what was unfolding. Veterans who had initially felt betrayed by Sarah's deception were now grappling with a more complex reality. Her lies had been wrong, but they had grown from a pain that many of them could understand. Sergeant Santos put away her handcuffs, though her expression remained troubled. "Admiral, while her real service is clearly significant, she still violated federal law by wearing unauthorized decorations and making false claims about her military record." Admiral Hayes nodded acknowledgement. "You're absolutely right, Sergeant. But I think there's an opportunity here for something better than just punishment. Sarah needs to face the consequences of her actions, but she also needs to understand the value of what she actually accomplished." Chief Webb stepped forward with a suggestion that surprised everyone. What if she told her real story? There are parts of that operation that have been declassified now. She could speak at veteran events about the real challenges of military service, including mental health struggles. The idea hung in the air, as everyone considered it. Sarah had been seeking recognition and respect through lies, but her real story, including her struggles with anxiety and her early discharge, might be more valuable to other veterans than any fictional heroics. "I don't know if I can," Sarah said quietly, talking about my anxiety, about failing to complete my service. "It's why I created the lies in the first place." The fear of judgment that had driven her deception was still very real. Admiral Hayes smiled with understanding. "Sarah, you didn't fail. You served in a classified operation, and when the stress became too much, you sought help. That takes more courage than most people realize. Your story, the real one, is about both service and recovery." Over the following hours, as the Veterans Day celebration wound down, Sarah found herself surrounded by actual veterans who were sharing their own stories of struggle and recovery. Many had dealt with PTSD, anxiety, and the challenge of transitioning back to civilian life. Her experience, while unique in its classified nature, wasn't unusual in its emotional challenges. By the end of the day, Sergeant Santos had decided to recommend community service rather than criminal prosecution, contingent on Sarah's agreement to seek counseling and stop her impersonation activities. Admiral Hayes had arranged for her to speak with a counselor who specialized in veterans with classified service histories. The SEALs who had initially suspected her of fraud had become some of her strongest supporters. Chief Webb exchanged contact information with her, promising to help connect her with resources for veterans dealing with anxiety and transition issues. The brotherhood she had tried to fake was being offered to her authentically. As the sun set over San Diego, Sarah stood once again near the memorial wall where her day of deception had nearly ended in arrest. But now, she wasn't alone. Real veterans stood with her, not because of lies she had told about fictional heroism, but because of shared experiences of service, struggle, and recovery. The small tattoo on her forearm would never again be hidden under false ribbons and invented stories. Instead, it would serve as a reminder of real service performed in shadows and of the day when truth finally proved more powerful than the lies she had used to hide from it. Admiral Hayes found her there as the park began to empty. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice kind but direct. Sarah considered the question carefully. Scared, she admitted, but also relieved. I've been carrying these lies for so long that I'd forgotten what truth felt like. She looked at the memorial wall, reading the names of sailors who had made the ultimate sacrifice. I want to honor their memory by being honest about my own service, even the parts I'm not proud of. The Admiral nodded approvingly. That's exactly what they would want. Your story, the real one, has the power to help other veterans who are struggling. Sometimes the most important battles are the ones we fight after we come home. As they prepared to leave, Sarah made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She would tell her real story, complete with classified service, mental health struggles, and the journey from deception back to truth. It wouldn't be as dramatic as the lies she had told, but it would be something far more valuable. It would be authentic. The Veterans Day that had begun with Sarah hiding behind false heroics ended with her surrounded by real heroes who had accepted her not despite her struggles, but because of their shared humanity. Her journey from imposter to inspiration had begun, built on the foundation of a small tattoo that had carried the truth all along.